I'm going to talk to you about minimum wages today. This is a topic that is, a lightning rod issue. It's an incredibly important issue in a number of different countries, a number of different contexts, but it's a very emotional issue. People get incredibly emotional about minimum wages, living wages, and basically the issue of labor wages more generally. So it's an incredibly emotional issue. Tensions run very high, but it's also an incredibly important issue because in terms of the total productivity of a given country, labor wages make up a huge share of what comes to be, gross national income or gross domestic product. In many countries, it's upwards of just shy of 70% of total GNP. So it's an incredibly important area of the economy. So when we're thinking about issues about economic freedom, economic prosperity, and what we learned from Michael earlier this morning about some of the places where Israel lags behind, labor market regulation is an incredibly important issue and perhaps something where some gains can be made. So emotional preconceptions exert one of the strongest influences over this type of a market, but it's one of the most important areas perhaps not to be overly emotional about. Now, economics has something to say about that because it tries to put aside a lot of the emotions that come with these issues and to try to look at the question analytically and to think through what some of the problems are. One of my favorite economists kind of describes the role or the art of economics as consisting in not just looking at the immediate effects of a particular policy, but the long-term effects of any act. Okay? It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy not merely for one group of people, okay, but for all groups. And so if this is our kind of guiding inspiration for looking at the minimum wage, then there's some kind of interesting and important things that we can say about it. Now, the first thing we have to understand if we're going to understand this issue is how wages are determined in general. Okay? So this is a very important issue for you guys in particular. So Bob told me that you want some very practical advice. Okay? This is a very practical piece of advice. How do you increase your wage? So I use the London pound note here because I used to teach in London. I also think it looks kind of pretty. But I'll denote most of my denominations in pounds today, but we can use any denomination you please. How do you increase your wage? You, as a practical individual going out into the job market. I'm sorry? What's that? You negotiate, okay? You can negotiate. And what is going to determine the range of your negotiation capabilities? Okay, skills. I'm sorry? Yeah, we're going to get to that. You're absolutely right. But I heard something else that was... Yes, your productivity. Right. Okay, so your productivity is going to determine the upper bound of your wage. You will never be paid more than that which you add, okay, to the value of the company or the organization or the product, right, that you are working for. So your productivity is going to determine that upper bound of your wage. What about that lower bound? What determines the lower bound of your wage? Well, we'll get to minimum wages in a minute. Well, I wish to have a lower minimum bound where I drink cappuccinos every day and fly around in a helicopter. But that's not going to happen. So what determines your lower bound? Yes, absolutely. It's exactly right. It's your alternatives. Another way to say that in economics terms is your opportunity costs. Okay? What relevant alternatives do you have available such that you are not in a position of needing to take the first thing that comes along? Okay? So within the lower bound of your opportunity costs and your alternatives and your productivity that you're adding to the bottom line, you're going to have a range to negotiate within that frame. But these are the two ways in which your wages will be determined. Okay? And that's the same anywhere. So this gives us kind of a clear understanding about if we want to raise the wages, okay, for anyone, okay, you either have to increase their productive capacity, there's a number of ways in which you can do that, or you have to increase, right, the alternatives that they have available at their disposal. Okay? Those are the two ways in which the magic happens and you get increases in wages and living standards over time. Tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about how we've seen productivity increases over the past 200 years that have been marvelous. Okay? But if we're thinking about it on an individual basis, it's always going to be bound by these two upper and lower bounds. So it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about wages, we're talking about real wages versus nominal wages. Okay? You have had the unfortunate experience of living in a country where you've seen a hyperinflation, or at least your parents have seen a hyperinflation. So you know the difference between a nominal wage and what the real purchasing power of your wage can be. So your wage is going to be comprised of not only, what you take home in actual physical currency, but the conditions of your job, if you like your fellow co-workers, if you have air conditioning, a nice office, right? And maybe any of the other benefits that come along with that, health care, child care, these types of things. So when we're talking about wages, we're really talking about real wages. So, okay, if I have a farm, this is just a simple example to drive home the point, but if I have a farm and I'm interested, I'm in the business of selling oranges, okay, the demand for labor is particularly usually a derived demand. Okay, it's derived from the value of the final product in which you're buying and selling. Okay, unless you have the ability to be your own boss. So if I have a farm and I'm producing oranges, I need workers to go out and collect those oranges. If I hire one additional worker, and that worker can collect 30 oranges per hour, okay, and the market price of that orange is 50p, okay, then the physical marginal productivity that they can produce is 30 oranges, okay, but their marginal value product, okay, is going to be upwards of 15 pounds. So that's going to be the upper bound of the wage that I will be willing and able to pay, okay, my next additional farmer. Okay? So that's just another way of saying that if it's profitable to hire a worker, it will only be so to the extent that their value exceeds the wage that they earn. Okay? And so if the value that the worker produces, okay, is greater or equal than the hourly wage, he's going to be profitable to employ. If it's not profitable to employ that worker. Okay? And profit-seeking entrepreneurs will search for alternatives. Okay? They'll search for substitutes. Okay, so before we figure out what happens when we have a minimum wage, we have to understand what this process of market equilibrium looks like. So if we have a labor supply curve, okay, consisting of all the people who are wanting to supply, willing and able to supply orange picking services. Now notice the labor supply curve is going to consist of individuals who may choose to supply more additional hours over time, but it may also, as the wage increases, induce new people to come into the market and supply orange picking services. If the wage was going up to 80 pounds an hour, okay, I might choose to get out on a ladder and start picking oranges. Okay, sounds pretty good. So we want to keep that in mind when we're thinking about what's the underlying factors under the labor supply curve. For the labor demand curve, it's all the people, right, who are willing and seeking to employ those who are picking oranges. So if the wage is below the intersection of our labor supply and demand curves, what's going to happen in a free-floating market arrangement? What would happen if there was a prevailing wage that was below the wage? Okay, no. We have prices that are willing to fluctuate freely. Anyone want to take a guess? Okay. So we have a wage, okay, I've shown you what the equilibrium price quantity combination in the market would be. Okay? But for some reason, okay, the wages being offered are lower than what would clear the market. So yeah. Okay? The wage is actually going to go up. So to be fair, I didn't put the wage on there, so it's a little bit unclear in my graph. Okay? But what's going to happen if there's a current prevailing wage that's below what would clear the market? Okay? Employers are going to want to hire more workers. Okay? At the lower wage, okay, there's not enough workers who are willing and able to supply that which demanders, okay, would like to have. So here's the important point. Employers are going to bid up the price of labor in this circumstance. Okay? So I have my arrows here to show the process of adjustment as we go back up towards reaching equilibrium. So here's the important point. In the situation in which wages are below the prevailing equilibrium rate, employers are competing with other employers, okay, to attract those workers up until the point in which they max out the value. Okay? Now, what happens if we have the same the opposite situation in a free-floating market? We have a wage being offered for these services that far exceeds what would be the equilibrium wage. Okay? The market process, yes, would push that wage back down. But this time it happens on the consumer side of things. Okay? Here, consumers would compete with other consumers for those jobs which are available at the prevailing rate. Okay? So the emphasis here is that counterintuitively to what you may understand, it's usually the case that producers are competing with other producers and consumers or laborers are competing with other laborers. Okay? Yes, so in this situation, workers are going to actually be bidding down the wage. So here you have a prevailing wage. Let's make it extreme so we can understand the situation. Let's say they want to pay them 80 pounds an hour, okay, to pick oranges, but the prevailing wage is 15 pounds an hour from our prior example. Okay? What does that mean? It means demanders for orange pickers are going to not demand very many workers, okay, to pick oranges because it's extremely costly to do so, right? But at the same time, a lot of people are going to want to pick oranges at 80 pounds an hour, me, myself included, okay? So what's going to happen is, okay, I'm going to go to my friend who owns the orange orchard. I'm going to get myself tongue-tied here. And I'm going to say, I would love to pick oranges for you. And I know all these other people want to pick oranges for you, but I'll pick oranges for you for 70 pounds an hour. Steal of a deal, right? Okay? Similarly, okay, someone else could come along and say, no, Emily, she's too expensive. 60 pounds an hour. Okay? And we would expect consumers or producers of labor, suppliers of labor, to then compete those wages back down until they were roughly equivalent to what that marginal value product, okay, is. So that's the dynamics of how markets, when wages are able to freely float, are going to be reflecting the underlying capabilities and productivities of the markets that buyers and sellers are interested in producing those products. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay, so it's this characteristic of the equilibrium wage and quantity combination that makes it unique because it's balancing both the competing interests of the suppliers on one hand and the demanders of labor on another, such that, okay, what's unique about this point and why there's a certain quantity that clears this market is because the next additional worker, okay, who wants to supply labor will not do so because they cannot be induced to do so over the cost of the resources that it would take to employ them. Okay? So that's the quality that equilibrium has that makes it a particularly unique situation. So when we introduce a minimum wage, we have a sense of how markets should be working. Okay? If there's liquidity in the market and we have kind of the labor mobility necessary to be able to be flexible to changes in price. Now, there's good reasons why sometimes we won't have that flexibility, but we'll put that issue to the side. So the minimum wage is a legally mandated minimum price or a price floor established to improve wages for suppliers of labor. That's the intended outcome of the policy, and that's typically why it's put in place. And it's important that it's legally mandated. So in order for it to be effective, it must be set above the market clearing rate. Okay? If it was set below the market clearing rate, it wouldn't be effective at all, right? It would be moot. So we know predictably what will happen. We'll get a surplus of labor. Okay? Quantity demanded will decrease. Okay? Quantity supplied is going to increase. Okay? More people are going to work at that want to be able to work at that higher price. Fewer workers will be demanded from businesses at that new higher price. And unemployment is going to increase, particularly for unskilled workers. So to see this in our graph, we can do the exact same example and put a few numbers on it. So I'm choosing arbitrary numbers here, but just so we can see the example. Okay? So the market clearing wage rate for our orange pickers in this example is £7.25. And at that wage, we have a quantity supplied and demanded of 100 workers. So if we were to institute a minimum wage in this circumstance, and we place that at £10.25 above the market clearing rate, right, we have an increase in the number of workers who would like to supply their labor, okay, and a decrease in the quantity demanded that people who are owning orchards would like to demand. So the result is unemployment, okay? And we can see that right here. Now the question is, who bears the cost of this type of policy? What happens? Well, as we've seen, minimum wages are typically imposed to raise the wages of the least well-off. Okay? That's their intended and stated goal. So they're often placed on industries or markets where the wages are particularly low and the labor employed is particularly unskilled. Okay? So when that's the case, okay, the unemployment that results works in such a way. Those few who are able to retain their jobs at the new higher level, okay, they benefit from the higher wages. Okay? So the quantity demanded that are able to keep their job at now £10.25, they benefit from this policy. But those people who were previously employed at the lower rate are no longer going to be employed at the new higher rate. They're going to be out of work. Okay. Now, what about these guys? These guys who are willing and able to supply orange picking labor at the new price of £10.25 will come and turn up to work to pick oranges and be disappointed. Okay? They'll find that there are no jobs available for them for picking oranges, okay, at £10.25 an hour. Okay? So we have a discrepancy here. While the policy may benefit the few who are able to keep their jobs, it's going to unemploy a large other portion of the population. Now, who are these people who are going to bear the cost? Well, most often, they're youth. They're the youngest people who have just kind of gotten into the labor market. They're the people who don't have a whole lot of skills, experience, training. Okay? I'm sorry?
People who are discriminated against are also groups with all the time finding jobs.
Yes.
Minimum wages.
Yes, we'll talk more about exactly that. There are people who may not have a lot of experience, who don't have a lot of skills, who otherwise, okay, may be the least fortunate amongst us. They may be subject of explicit discrimination, okay? Sometimes they can be people whose skills have atrophied or who are not valued at what the prevailing rate would be with the minimum wage, okay? So the point to drive home is that the people who end up bearing the cost of these policies are particularly those who are the intended beneficiaries. Okay? Yes. That's right. Okay, so great point. Here's another example where the curves are a little bit different. Okay, now here, right, our unemployment has been exacerbated. What determines the shape of our supply and demand curves? The market. Elasticity. What's another word for elasticity? Yes. We've got price theorists in the back, right? How sensitive, okay, either our demanders of labor or our suppliers of labor are to changes in price. Okay? Now there's a lot of factors that can influence how sensitive particular demanders are, employers, firms are in different markets. Okay? But oftentimes when we're dealing with unskilled labor, okay, there's many other different substitutions that firms can have in place of unskilled or low-skilled wage labor. We're particularly seeing it now with the introduction of more and more technology, okay, to substitute for wage employment. So you're absolutely right that the shape of the curves are going to determine the magnitude of the unemployment. Okay, it's an incredibly important point because what does it mean? It means that it'll be different in different markets. It means that it's always going to be an empirical issue as to how much, okay, unemployment is going to result. And it's also going to mean that it really matters what the difference is between the minimum that you place on a market and what the prevailing underlying equilibrium rate would be. Okay? Those are all very important issues, and I think that's excellent that you're attuned to those. So the responsiveness of both laborers and firms to changes in price are going to determine that magnitude. Okay? And the difference between the prevailing market rate for that labor and the minimum wage that's imposed is going to impact the magnitude. Okay, so we have the mechanics down. How many of you have ever heard of economics being called the dismal science? A few? Yeah? Everyone always says, oh, economics, that's the dismal science. And it's true, economists are pretty boring at parties often. Okay? Totally unrelated issue. But most of the time, those who have heard economics called the dismal science think that it was Thomas Carlyle who coined the term, and they're right. It was Thomas Carlyle. Okay, he was a very popular popularizer of ideas. Did a number of things in Britain at the time. But everyone thinks that it was Carlyle who coined the term against Malthus. Against Malthus' negative prediction, his very gloomy prediction that basically, right, the demographic trends of the country were going to outpace our ability to create food, okay, and there would be this Malthusian trap that we were stuck in. Okay, now Malthus turned out to be wrong on that prediction, even though Malthus himself's prediction was better than that. But that's not who Carlyle's target was when he called economics the dismal science. His target was actually John Stuart Mill. Now, he was targeting Mill, okay, because Mill was arguing that it was institutions, okay, that determined whether or not countries and laborers were productive or unproductive, and not questions of race. Okay? Carlyle was a big believer that there were superior and inferior races, okay? And that's what basically drove productivity. Mill, on the other hand, argued that no, fundamentally, human nature is the same across individuals, okay? And it's actually the rules of the game and the institutions that drive the differentials in outcome. Now, Mill wasn't alone in this idea, okay? But this is what drove Carlyle to call economics the dismal science. It was dismal because it treated people as equals. Okay? He didn't think that that was very good. Now, Smith so Mill was not the first to have this idea. Adam Smith, the father of economics. When Deirdre McCloskey talks about Smith, she says, Adam Smith. Okay. He had this same idea. In The Wealth of Nations, he says the difference of natural talents in men is, upon many occasions, not so much the cause as the effect of the division of labor. The difference between the most dissimilar characters, between a philosopher and a common street porter, for example, seems to arise not so much more from nature as from habit, custom, and education. His point is that fundamentally, our human nature is the same, and it's these institutions, okay, which determine the differences, okay, between productivity. What does this have to do with the minimum wage at all, right? Did I just take a big digression in our conversation? No, this has a lot to do with the minimum wage because the origins of the minimum wage very much have their kind of dark, shady, and really ugly past that many people don't know very much about. So there's a great book out. It's called Illiberal Reformers. It's by a historian of economic thought named Thomas Leonard. He's also published this work in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. It's one of my favorite papers because it's so shocking and most people do not know the history. But what Thomas Leonard documents in this paper is about the rise of progressivism in the United States and how it came with a lot of very unsavory ideas. One of which was these ideas of eugenics, the idea that we could use science and scientific tools to improve human population by specifically controlling breeding, okay, and heritable traits, okay, had a lot of nasty connotations and of course fell out of disfavor after the Nazis. But at the time of the progressive era, these ideas were scientifically taken very seriously, and there were a lot of people who respectively could call themselves eugenicists. So Henry Rogers Seeger is an American economist, very prominent American economist. He said, he was quoted in economics journals as saying, if we are to maintain a race that is to be made up of capable, efficient, and independent individuals and family groups, we must courageously cut off the lines of hereditary that have proved to be so undesirable by isolation or sterilization. Okay, these are incredibly nasty ideas. But they also formed the backbone under which many social reformers advocated minimum wages. So this is a quote from Sydney. This is actually from the Webb, Sydney and Beatrice Webb, published in the Journal of Political Economy, where they say, we put it plainly, with regard to certain sections of the population, quote, the unemployable, this unemployment is not a mark of social disease, but actually of social health. All of the ways of dealing with these unfortunate parasites, okay, the most ruinous to the community is to allow them to unrestrainedly compete as wage earners. So Sydney and Beatrice Webb actively advocated for using minimum wages precisely because they were a very efficient tool of identifying who those unemployables were and making them less able to reproduce, okay, within the population. It's a very sick notion. But it contrasts with this tradition that came from Adam Smith of treating all treating all individuals as having the same fundamental human nature, okay, and capacities. And this extends through a number of different thinkers, but the underlying unifying theme here is that they regarded unemployment as a social cost of minimum wages, not as a social benefit. And it was part of the analytics of their economics that worked this way. So here's the interesting point. At the time of these debates, you could have Sydney or Beatrice Webb, okay, this is Beatrice, okay, looking at the exact same model of how the economy worked as Philip Wicksteed over here, okay, and they both agreed on the fundamentals. There was no disagreement that a minimum wage above the prevailing market wage would create unemployment. It's just that they had very different normative presumptions about what that meant, okay? Beatrice Webb thought it was a very efficient policy for identifying the unemployable. Okay? Philip Wicksteed thought, no, actually, that's a social cost of the minimum wage, not a social benefit. Now, why do I bring this up? It's not just because it's an incredibly emotional and loaded understanding of the minimum wage. It's because the debate has shifted. Okay? In much of the modern debates about the minimum wage, okay, the focus is much more on the intentions of the policymakers, not so much on the actual outcomes of the policy. Okay, at the time it was introduced, both sides of the debate agreed on the outcome. That was not up for debate. It was whether or not that was a good thing or a bad thing. Now today, when we have policymakers, this is the former Secretary of Labor in the United States. Her name is Ms. Hilda Solis. Okay. She wrote right before a minimum wage hike was scheduled to hit the federal government in 2009. She wrote an opinion or editorial in a very prominent U.S. newspaper claiming that the minimum wage helps women. Okay. Now that's true, but that's, right, a sin of omission. Okay? That's not the entire story. There's some people who stand to gain by the introduction of the minimum wage, but there's also a good deal of the population that is going to be harmed. And that was never mentioned in the policy. The policy has come to be judged more on the intentions of the people who are enacting it rather than the outcomes that it generates. One of the tools of economics is to suggest that we should look at what the actual evidence and the outcomes are, okay? And then that can be a useful tool to informing our normative positions on a variety of different policies, right? Okay, so I'm getting close to my time, and I want to make sure that we have lots of time for discussion. But this is too good not to do, and I've still got 5 minutes. So in 2009, when they were going to enact this new federal hike in the minimum wage in the United States, okay, the National Public Radio ran a story on the minimum wage hike. And you had economists coming out, okay, and, you know, pointing out that in particular, these types of policies, even if the shapes of the supply and demand curve are such that it's not going to nationally, okay, generate huge amounts of unemployment, it is going to impact the least well-off workers, particularly teenagers in the US. Okay? So this was in July of 2009. Economists come out and say, well, if we estimate it, it's probably going to eliminate about 300,000 jobs for the people between the ages of 16 and 24. Okay? And same economist points out, given that we're in a situation of a recession at the time, it seems like a particularly bad idea. Well, what happened? Okay? Come October in 2009, okay, stories are now being run in the newspaper of the joblessness that has resulted from this minimum wage hike. Teen unemployment rate at the time hit 25.9%, highest since World War II. And hardest hit of all were black male teens, whose unemployment rate shot up to over 50%. Okay? The outcomes were predictable, they were knowable, and they happen. Okay? In just the same way that the economists warned. So,
are those results influenced by the 2008 crisis?
So this was after the crisis, but this is precisely what David Newark was pointing out at the time. He was saying this is exactly the point in which you don't want to impose a minimum wage, because firms who are trying to rebound from the financial crisis haven't yet fully kind of reorganized and been able to hire. So it's a particularly bad time to be...
I mean, the question is, how can you determine if the decrease in jobs wouldn't happen anyways?
Yeah, so there's a number of like very technical papers that statistically do control for that by creating, right, basically a counter narrative about what otherwise would have happened had that not been the case. But we can look at some of, and I'll talk about some of that in Q&A if you like. But basically, this is just, I'm just drawing this straight from the newspaper. Okay, so this is just looking at the kind of raw figures. It's not at all kind of controlling for many of the other variables that can happen. Okay, but then by the time you get to March of the following year, okay, they had instituted another increase, and it was particularly ill-timed because, again, while the recession was ending, employers had not yet had confidence to hire. Okay? So to raise the cost of unskilled labor precisely at a time when this was disastrous, okay, the newspaper said is an act of almost willful economic stupidity. Okay? So a Congress that had spent $862 billion to create jobs thus had managed to increase the harm to tens of thousands of entry-level job seekers. Okay? And again, they point out that this is done in the name of compassion or the living wage, but in fact, that's not the case. Okay? So, there's many issues involved, and I hope to take up some of this in Q&A, but we can cover whatever you like to talk about. In what Michael had talked about at the first session about measuring properly unemployment, okay, minimum wages. I'm just bringing down the house here. Okay, there's many technical issues involved in that, and so many empirical economists go back and forth about how do we accurately estimate these types of effects, how do we make sure that we adequately control for confounding variables, okay, for things that are otherwise not accounted for in the analysis. How do we effectively estimate the responsiveness of firms and laborers to changes in these prices? These are all incredibly difficult things to do. They're not straightforward, and so there is a lot of disagreement over how precisely to go about this, okay? But a number of economists have done some meta-studies of all of the studies of the minimum wages that they've looked at, okay? And this is the one that most clearly comes across, okay? But basically they find that there's relatively none. They say only specifically like very, very specific circumstances, okay? But there's no indication of positive effects, positive wage effects from instituting minimum wages. And in most cases, you do see some indication of negative employment effects. But they also find that when you do see these negative employment effects, you always see them amongst the least skilled and least well-off in the particular populations, okay? So it's a very real thing that these negatively impact precisely those groups of people that we think or we would hope that they're intended to help. Give me 1 minute and then you're first on the queue. So the point is to think about markets as a price system, okay? And a price system like a thermometer. And what does a thermometer gauge? Temperature, okay? Reality would be another way to say it, okay? So if I told you that you know, there's a fire in this room and it's all of a sudden, you know, boiling point temperatures, okay? And if there was someone who came up and said, well, I can cool it down, I'll just put a pin in the thermometer, okay, at freezing. Okay? Would you believe them? No. You would say that's not at all addressing the fundamental fire that's burning in this room right now. You would say you've just adjusted where the pin is. Okay? Thermometers gauge reality, okay, just as market prices reflect fundamental features about productivity and alternative options. Okay? You can't change those fundamental features by just sticking a pin, right, in the market, by placing a minimum wage wherever you feel would be appropriate. Okay? So in order to address those types of questions, you have to address the fundamentals that underlie how wages are determined in the first place. So tomorrow we're going to be talking a lot about what those fundamentals actually are. What are those institutions which create lasting and permanent prosperity for the entire population? So Bob asked me to title the talk Solution or Problem. Well, if the minimum wage is intended to be a viable means to significantly and persistently raising the wages of the least well off, it's not a solution, right? Is it a problem? Well, yes, if it disproportionately is harming those who have the most to gain by accepting low wage employment, gaining skills and opportunity sets, and if we care about not disemploying others at the same time, then it's a problem. Okay? So that's my 2 cents on this, but I'd love to open it up to a discussion, hear from you, answer questions, and anything else you'd like to talk about.
The decision whether to raise market rates might be determined by a macroeconomic cycle. This decision will go around the market itself. It's a local decision, of course, calculated.
Well, at a fundamental level, it's not going to be related. Now, there's a, in the kind of anecdotal or the casual evidence that I presented to you, right? It's particularly bad idea to do it if you're in a recession, okay? Why? Because you can exacerbate those problems due to labor market rigidities, okay? So part of, the flexibility that we tried to talk about when we talk about when wages are free to adjust is that workers can move between occupations more easily, right? You're not going to see persistent unemployment in the same way, but if there's rigidities to laborers moving between occupations, changing jobs, if firms are reluctant to hire for particular reasons, that's only going to make the problem worse. But the underlying fundamentals about the difference between what the prevailing wage would be and the minimum wage that you impose on it, I don't think is going to be, it can only be exacerbated by recessions.
Is it raise it by step? It's like $5, or I can make it jump.
I just think, I would say minimum wages in general are just a really bad policy if what you want to do is raise the wages of unskilled laborers. There's lots of other policies that you may or may not want to adopt, but this seems like it's particularly both theoretically and empirically not a good one for doing that. I'll go around. We'll mix it up.
Although I completely agree with your bottom line. Hi. So although I completely agree with your bottom line and about the importance of the fundamental parameters in the market, so you spoke about the alternatives in the bottom bar and the productivity in the upper bar, and of course to try virtually to raise the minimum wage above the productivity bar, it's ridiculous. But what about the effectiveness of the minimum wage inside those bars? Because I think over there, when we are talking about negotiations, it might be pretty helpful.
Yeah, so you mean, so on a definitional and technical point, minimum wages are not going to be effective unless they're over and above that productivity bound, okay?
Why not? If you're talking about workers, that they have their alternatives in X lower bar, and they have the productivity in a Y upper bar, okay, between those two parameters, it's only a negotiation between them and the business.
Sure. So there's...
And I believe also you can see a lot of empirical results like this, but even if you're talking about Israel today, we are raising our minimum wage all the time, and we don't have any unemployment problem, not at all. And I believe that, yeah, so in a crisis time, so the productivity bar actually going down, and the alternative even going lower. So over there, it's a problem. But if you're talking about a conversation between those bars, and if you are careful enough, you do help a lot of lower skills people by raising their negotiation power.
So there's a couple of issues there. First of all, our basic kind of understanding that we've presented here assumes we haven't introduced shifts in terms of the labor supply curve. Okay, so if you have immigration or you have tightly controlled immigration, okay, you're going to, in terms of the aggregate labor supply, that will have an effect or not an effect. In terms of the fundamental question that you get to about bargaining within the range of the lower bound and the upper bound, there's a number of different things that can go on within that range. So the point about the minimum wage as being effective, it's only effective to the extent that it's over and above what that productivity bound is. So the assumption in the model is that, or with the model, we can actually solve for what that equilibrium wage rate is. In reality, right, it's not altogether clear exactly what that productivity bound is for particular industries, for particular occupations. Okay, so if you see a minimum wage, right, and you're witnessing, you're not seeing a high amount of unemployment, it could be that minimum wage just isn't an effective bound, that the productivity and the capacity of those workers is just above, okay, what it is that minimum is pushing on, okay, which is good for the workers, right? But okay, it still doesn't get to your fundamental point about the bargaining, okay? Now, there's a lot of different ways in which wage and wage negotiations can be improved, okay? Particularly when we talk about individual negotiation versus collective bargaining. What Jose pointed out earlier today about some of the reforms that they undertook in Chile sound like very reasonable reforms for collective bargaining. Why? Because they're based at the firm level. They're not covering an entire heterogeneous group of laborers. So one of the particularly nasty problems of minimum wages is that they're covering industries that are incredibly diverse, that have totally different underlying productivities and totally different capacities for workers. So to the extent that you want to improve the bargaining powers of particular workers, you're better off doing that if they're tailored to the industries or the particular firms that those workers are working in. So in terms of like collective bargaining issues, I would push more in those directions. It's not to say that, that those issues are not important. Thank you. Yeah.
So my question is about the other options we have.
Yeah.
So if we want to keep, let's say, 4% unemployment is fine for us, and if it versus the wage goes down to 3,000 shekels per month, then we prefer the other option, like 4% unemployment for the next, 10 years. So what would you say about that? Because it sounds like in the market, the wage can go down actually to a situation that the poverty would be worse than just unemployment of, whatever it is now.
So, the first fundamental fact that we're going to talk a lot more about tomorrow is what is the pattern for wages and wage growth over time, okay? What we generally see is competition, especially when you have very robust competition, puts upward pressure on wages for laborers over time. That's a persistent, stylized fact about how wages increase over time. So, when we think about what leads to long-term wage growth, which is what we all want, okay, we want robust, healthy competition that's putting that upward pressure on wages. There's not the same fundamental tendency to push those wages down. So that's a feature that can be enhanced by better institutions, better rule of law, protection of property rights. We can think about some of the very kind of concrete ways in which we can improve that condition. But basically, competition does put upward pressure on laborers' wage. The second point of that is, well, you say if there's going to be this, negative shock, and we know that we're going to experience this decline, would we not prefer to trade that off to having some higher unemployment, okay, at the expense to avoid that fall in wages? Now, there's a couple of issues at hand there. The first is that I'm highly skeptical that any kind of policymaker in the Department of Labor is going to be able to accurately and precisely anticipate those kinds of changes and to make those trade-offs in a way that is actually reflective of the underlying condition. But that's my bias, and I'm highly skeptical of the ability to do that and to adjust those changes over time in a way that makes sense. We have a long, long history of wages and price controls. This is not in the United States or in the UK or even in Israel, but this is across human societies. Okay? And in many cases, there's always this political pressure, okay, to institute wage and price controls. And the political pressure is because they all conform to the same kind of logic, which is bad economics, but it's good politics, which is wages and price controls tend to benefit very small, specific groups of people that it's very easy to point to and say, look, they've benefited, but the costs are dispersed amongst all of those people, right? A much wider portion of the population that are not organized, do not have an organized voice, who can't, easily point to and say, you were the one who is bearing the cost of these policies. And so in many cases, like in the example that I put up of the US Secretary of Labor, it's very easy for her to say, look, this minimum wage hike benefits single mothers. Okay? It benefits the single mothers that retain their jobs at the new higher wages. She can't point to the numerous people who have had their wages cut, their hours cut, or can no longer find jobs at those new higher wages to speak about the policy. And so it becomes lopsided politically, but advantageous. And so that's a long-winded answer to your question, which was, can politicians accurately make these trade-offs should they suspect that we're going to experience a downturn in wages? And I'm just highly skeptical that they can make those kind of, that they can maneuver that with that much agility and that they can effectively measure and quantify those trade-offs.
If you raise the minimum wage, then the company that this worker is working, the whole industry has the same kind of workers, and then they can just put the prices higher on the products, and then the poor people that are buying those products will pay more. So can you is there a correlation like this logic works?
Okay, so there's a couple of issues. I mean, the first is if you put, so you're saying if you put a higher wage across the entire industry, can't they just pass that along to their consumers, right, and then raise the price? Theoretically, it could be possible, okay? But the problem with that is that, again, it's fundamentals that are usually driving the rates of return. What investors are looking at are rates of return on investment, okay? And, right, any kind of entrepreneur who has money in capital markets that's at all fluid is going to look for the greater rate of return on investment. So, okay, to the extent that you have one particular industry or firm that's being driven up as a result of this price, okay, it's going to lower their rate of return on investment, ceteris paribus, holding all the other things constant. Okay? In that case, what you're going to see is entrepreneurs withdrawing their capital from those and that industry paying a price as a result. Okay? So there's good reasons to suspect that that's not a sustainable policy in general, but it's also good reasons to suspect that's not going to lead to growth and wage productivity over time. Okay? Yeah. I'm sorry, I'll take her and then you in the back.
So my question is, what is going to be about the unemployment money that people get when they're unemployed? Because if wages naturally go lower, maybe some people will prefer to stay unemployed than rather seek another job.
Yeah. So there's two issues there. Okay, the first is how responsive are unskilled laborers to changes in the wage rate. What's particularly important about the minimum wage and imposing it on unskilled labor is precisely those workers who are looking at the trade-offs and thinking, this just isn't worth my time. Others who haven't gained the necessary skills and experience, right, can benefit from taking opportunities that may be below what we consider to be the minimum wage at the time. So we want to, I think you're absolutely right to look at what the trade-offs are for the individuals that are looking at these particular questions about whether or not to supply labor at all or whether or not to supply additional labor and at what price. The second point to your question is about unemployment insurance. This is a whole topic for a whole nother debate, but there's at least good reasons to suggest that either employer provided unemployment insurance or unemployment that's provided by the state can be a better option if what you're trying to do is guarantee, okay, a safety net, okay, for the least well off. It's certainly, in my opinion, better than imposing high minimum wages across markets that are very diverse and heterogeneous in terms of skill sets and labor employment options. But it introduces a number of other particular problems, precisely the marginal tax rate that people face when they go to supply additional units of labor. We can talk about some of those issues, but basically you don't want to be disincentivizing people from entering the market, right, where they could be productively supplying skills and earning wages. And that's, there's Milton Friedman's, he's come up, I think, in every session now. His earned income, negative income tax policy was a policy that was presented precisely to try to smooth that transition from unemployment to employment, and not to make it hard or difficult on those people who are currently out of the labor market to make the choice to supply their labor. So that's a particular policy set in place to try to smooth that transition such that there's not a high marginal tax rate that you face when you want to go, say, from outside the labor market to in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So given the history of the minimum wages, as you pointed to us, and given the big effect on unemployment, how do you explain that minimum wages are so common around the world?
Well, the first answer is what I alluded to in terms of the fact that they make for very good politics and really poor economics. Okay? So minimum wages are a way that politicians can very clearly signal that they are wanting to help the worst off in society. And if all you see are the benefits and you don't pay attention to the costs, then from the public's perspective, this looks like an effective policy. Okay? That's one answer about why they're politically popular. And they seem to be politically popular across a lot of time and space precisely because it's very hard to see those who are negatively affected by it. So it just doesn't resonate. The second point, though, about about why they're political. So you have the fact that they're politically popular, but you also don't see politicians typically employing large changes in the minimum wage. Okay? So the magnitude of the difference between what the productivity of the the workers are and what the minimum wage is set at. Historically, it's usually been kind of reasonable minimum wages. You don't see politicians campaigning on setting 100 pound minimum wages in a market where the prevailing rate is 10 pounds, right? You see small incremental. And that, I think, also kind of accords with the political story that you're not trying to, what you're trying to do is something very different than actually helping the poor. You're trying to demonstrate to the public that you can satisfy their demand for helping the least well off, not necessarily actually deliver on the results. That's my speculation. We don't have like hard evidence on that. Yeah.
Can you please point some advantages of this policy?
So it clearly advantages those people who are able to find and secure and keep a job at the new prevailing rate. Okay? So there's two portions of the population that it's going to impact. Those who are able to find and keep and retain a job at the new higher rate, they're clear beneficiaries. They're making an hourly wage that's higher and better than they would otherwise have made absent that policy. However, there's also another component of that same labor market that is unemployed as a result of those people earning over and above what their productivity dictates. And so the beneficiaries of that policy are going to say it's a great policy. You've increased my wage. You've increased it more than my productivity demands. But the unseen component to that policy, right? We want to care about the seen and the unseen. The unseen are the people who can't hold jobs at that new rate, who don't get hired at that rate, or have their hours cut or their benefits cut as a result. So one of the big pushes in the US when you've instituted these step of federal incremental increases in the wages is you've seen people kind of move to more part-time work. Okay? So maybe their hourly wage has remained the same, but they don't have the 40 hours a week that they were having before. They're only being hired at, say, 35 hours a week or 30 hours a week. And so all of those are ways in which employers are going to try to adjust to those higher minimum wages. So the beneficiaries are the ones who are able to secure those jobs. The costs are those who don't.
I'm wondering, what is your suggestion to actually deal with this situation? Because I work in a hotel, and in hotel business, you know, they would take anyone at the minimum possible, and as long as they raise up the wages, they cut the workers, and it's a problem I really feel anyway. So I'm just wondering, what is your suggestion? Because if they could, they would pay me like 5 shekels an hour. They would.
Absolutely, and that's exactly consistent with our model. Okay, the fact of the matter is that there is constraints on their ability to pay you 5 shekels an hour. Okay, they do face competition, which drives that wage up. Now, for an individual level, okay, I think the advice is clear. Okay, first, okay, think about always increasing your productivity. Okay, have that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about employment opportunities that are available to you, right? How do I bring value to this organization that I'm working in? Okay, and oftentimes, and more so as we move into kind of a more information-driven landscape, there's going to be creative and innovative ways to actually bring and add value to various different organizations. So on a personal level, thinking about that. The others is, how can I increase my alternative options? Okay, Jose was talking about how he has the autonomy that he had in his position in Chile. Okay, was precisely generated from the fact that he was willing to walk away and take other alternative offers at any time. And that allowed him, okay, the ability to be able to have that autonomy within that in that job and to do great things. So if you can always have alternative offers or think about alternatives to what you have currently, you're going to be putting upward pressure on your own wage. Now that's just a personal advice type answer to that question. In general, we're going to talk a lot more tomorrow about what are some of the long-term trends and how do we kind of increase productivity overall. Traditionally, this has been capital augmented labor. So labor becomes more productive when it has, right, capital to make it more productive. You're more productive as a student when you have your tablet or your laptop to be able to work on, right? You become more productive as you increase your own human capital to the extent that education is actually making you, translated into value added in a variety of different things that you're going to do in the future. So we'll talk a little bit more about what are those underlying trends that are pushing productivity up over time. But what I'm going to foreshadow is that it's only through productivity gains that we've gotten, right, the prosperity that we've, and I say we, when I say globally, we have seen in the last 200 years. It's all been a result of increases in productivity gains. So we can talk about what some of those underlying institutions are that can free those up. Yeah.
I think it's a little bit harsh to talk about the market. There's one labor market. I think there's a lot of industries, a lot of levels, specialization. So within each labor sector, maybe we need a minimum wage, because in those areas where you actually apply a minimum wage, the competition and the market, the supply and demand, would be less than the minimum that you would have to buy to survive, for example, on the there's probably also in statistics, for example, you can probably estimate how much somebody needs to survive. Of course, neighborhood, there has to be like a minimum, how do you say, basket of goods you have to buy. So in those areas, that labor that is minimum wage, for example, in that market specifically, maybe the point of equilibrium would be less than the minimum to survive. So maybe that's the reason why in that specific market you need a minimum wage. But
yeah, so the point that I'll emphasize in response to yours is that what I try to illustrate in talking about the dynamics of how markets perform is we tend to think about competition and we tend to think about the relationships between labor and firms as labor and firms are in competition with one another, right? We conceptualize it, within the exploiter and exploitee, okay? But what I tried to demonstrate in the dynamics of market competition is that in reality, firms compete against other firms for laborers, and laborers compete against other laborers for jobs. So the competition is not between firms and laborers, okay? Firms compete with other firms, laborers compete with other laborers, and so as such, okay, competition amongst firms for labor puts upward pressure on wages, okay? That's part of the micro story of the macro picture that we see over the long-term trend, okay? So in any given bargaining situation, it is you who's bargaining against your employer, okay? But in the market-generated setting, it's firms that are competing against other firms, which drives up wages over time, okay? So that's the first part. The second part that I really liked about your question that I thought was really interesting and we haven't had a chance to talk about is the kind of the issues of labor complementarities versus substitutability. So we tend to think of, and in some of the kind of basic stylized picture that I've presented, we've presented labor as just being a homogeneous good, right? But that's not the case, okay? Labor is incredibly heterogeneous, okay? And the industries in which it's employed are incredibly diverse. So we've kind of given a very simplistic picture of the problem, but when we think about kind of dynamics over time, we want to understand how is it that various different labor and capital combinations work together so as to complement and increase productivity, and when do things like labor and capital compete for performing the same types of tasks? And what are the dynamics of how that plays out over time? This is really important questions, but I'm glad that you raised that point because it's important.
Can you present us the opposite policy results, such as lowering the minimum wage? I mean, you presented us earlier the result of raising the minimum wage.
Okay, so do we have particular examples of lowering the minimum wage? So
in Scandinavia, there is none. There was never any minimum wage in Sweden and Denmark. I think that's a good example.
that's very good. I don't know very much about those cases, so I would like to look into those more. But thank you for chiming in. I know of some cases in which minimum wages have been set, but then the productivity of the labor kind of outpaces those minimum wages such that they're no longer kind of effective bounds on what those markets are producing. Larry, do you have?
There are lots of cases where inflation has eroded the real minimum wage and
right.
more and more irrelevant.
That's a good example as well. I'll think about that and I'll see if I can come up with a really good counterexample for you later this afternoon. Off the top of my head, nothing's right there. Thank you.
I think I have maybe alternative explanation.
Yeah.
I think that the model doesn't. I think that maybe we forgot to think about the psychology a bit of this thing, because you assume that the labor work, the employees will act rationally. As I'm working for minimum wage, and I know that other workers are elderly, or people that don't know the language so good. So I think that the perception that they will act rationally if they are not paid enough and go and look for other job, it doesn't occur in the real life. That's the reason why employers can pay them not as their value, and that's maybe, for my opinion, the explanation why, although the minimum wage in Israel is high, the unemployment rate doesn't go up because they are not paid enough money.
Okay, so there's a couple of issues that you raise here. In terms of the psychology of it, I have kind of two contrasting points. The first is that the fundamental backbone to economics is that people respond to incentives. So it may be, right, that they aren't as responsive as you think that they would be, okay, or they will be more responsive over time. That's the case, but I tend to hold that as a pretty strong and robust finding across a number of different areas. But the second thing to that is that there are cases in which the psychology of the labor market matters a lot. And in any one instance, I mean, there's some cases of firms paying wages that are over and above what the prevailing rate are precisely because they don't want their employees to go out and look for alternative jobs. They'd like to retain them in, and to do so, right, they bid up those wages, even over and above what their productivity may dictate, because, they're very sensitive to losing those. And we call those, efficiency wages, but, oftentimes they're playing on kind of a desire to minimize the transaction costs of labor turnover and also to retain those employees that they don't want to bid away. So I don't think that that's perhaps not the issue, but I tend to think that those are second order concerns to the fundamentals of incentives, because when people are faced with the differences, if you continue to push it, eventually people do respond to price signals. It's just they may not be very responsive in the short run for a lot of reasons. It could be psychology, but it could just be the transaction costs of actually going out and finding another job are very high. It could also be that there are a lot of labor regulations and barriers to changing employment. One of the things that we didn't talk about today are occupational licensing laws. These are incredibly strong barriers to preventing labor mobility across a variety of different occupations because they make it very costly for people to change, even moderately between employments. So those are other labor market rigidities that have real significant outcomes for how the population of labor can be flexible to changing circumstances, to changing underlying conditions. But very good points. Thank you. Yes, please.
Well, I have a question. I understand the graph that you show us.
Yeah.
It's a very basic graph in economy.
Yep.
But it's displayed the status in the entire market of a certain country. But if I take a micro look, for example, of a very small town with only one place of work, of job, sorry, if there isn't any minimum wage, all the people in this town can be disadvantaged from the work manager. He can just pay, for example, £1, even if their job is equal for £5, for example, because he is a monopoly. He have all the power to do so. So, what is your what is the solution for this problem? For example, if we cancel the wage minimum.
Yeah. So, I mean.
And it's happened a lot in the world. There is only one place of work in small towns, or there is many disadvantages of the managers of their workers because of that. So what is the solution?
Yeah, so the place that the context in which I know the most about this actually is when you talk about third world sweatshop labor in countries that don't have the rule of law, that you have a wide scope for exploitation of labor in those particular circumstances. In that case, the evidence is quite clear that the more foreign multinational companies that you have within the market, okay, the more upward pressure you have on wages. The problem, okay, is a lack of competition for those workers. It's not, so monopoly is certainly a concern, right? We don't, monopolists like to try to restrict quantity and raise price. And without competition, you're not going to have that same pressure to bid up wages for, the same type of labor. So absolutely, I would think that that's a problem. But I think the solution is thinking about what are the fundamental institutions that create the conditions for robust competition over time. So.
But in Israel, and I'm certain that even in the United Kingdom, there is, for example, a small town with only one supermarket, one grocery store, one mall, and there isn't a lot of job opportunities. So there is this kind of situation can happen when the workers in this town, because it's a very far town from the center of the country, if there isn't a wage minimum, they will earn a very small amount of money. For example, a person who lives in a very big city.
So I agree when the relative comparison is someone who lives in a thriving market where there is lots of competition to someone who lives in a rural market where there's one monopolistic producer, that the workers in this situation are going to be worse off. I don't think that wage minimums are the best way to help those workers in those particular circumstances, precisely because you have the unemployment effects that come along with them. There's many other ways in which you could help workers in that circumstance, okay, on a one-off, as a particular policy position. As a general condition, the idea is that you want to introduce more competition and more options for those people in that particular location. Again, thinking about what determines the wages, you want to try to lift up the number of opportunities and alternatives that they have available. And I don't think that imposing wage controls is going to address those fundamental underlying issues. Yeah.
Right now, all around the world, we have a policy for a wage minimum. So if we want to get rid of it, is it better to just remove it or keep it until the inflation will just make it irrelevant?
I think it certainly depends on particular circumstances. It may be that there's already productivity and upward pressure on wages that, these actually aren't causing huge unemployment effects. In those circumstances, I would say, okay, hopefully, productivity will increase and we won't have additional measures that come along with that. But in terms of public policy, my concern is not so much that, such as there's a basic lack of economic understanding that goes along with introducing these policies. And it's part and parcel of a kind of an entire shift where policies are automatically adopted because the intentions of the policymakers are said to be good, okay? Without any evidence that they actually do what they're intended to do. And that, I think, is particularly, a dangerous situation to get into, because you have places like in the Northeast United States where they've introduced minimum wages in upwards of $15 an hour for workers at, say, McDonald's or fast food restaurants, and almost immediately those jobs were mechanized, right? Now that doesn't do anything to help the people who need their first job, who have to learn, the soft skills that go along with turning up for a job, being on time, being responsible, learning what it's like, to interact with employees and employers and customers and all of those bits that come along with it. So I'm much more worried about the lack of economic understanding that comes along with adopting some of these policies, because if you're only looking at the beneficiaries, then you're ignoring all of the people who are bearing the full costs of those decisions. And I just don't think that that's good economics.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just wondering what you think about universal basic income.
So I hope we can get into discussing this you've just opened up a big can of worms. There's two kind of ideas about this. In one sense, so this is the shortest answer I could possibly give. There's really good libertarian arguments for universal basic income on a theoretical level. If what you're saying is what we're going to do is replace the entire hodgepodge of kind of one-off welfare cobbled together policies that we have now. If we scrap all of that and replace it with the universal basic income, there's really good libertarian arguments for why it is that might be a preferable thing to do. Okay? I'm skeptical of a number of those arguments precisely because we don't, we're rarely in the situation of being able to overhaul an entire welfare system. And more often than not, we're adding policies without actually reforming the entire system. But that's not to say that I don't think that there are good arguments for it. I think that
the idea is to maybe cancel almost everything we did before, and
the idea is to get rid of all these kind of very specific ways in which we try to help the poor, but the money never really goes to the poor. There's systematic political tendencies for why that's the case. And replace that with a universal basic income. Second problem with the universal basic income that the critics haven't fully addressed is really what the level would be necessary for it to be an effective counter. Again, if you're in a position in which you can take away a lot of the other services that are provided by the state and substitute it with a universal basic income, there are good reasons to do that. But there's also the logic of politics that goes along that makes me very skeptical that we can actually do that. I don't like that argument though, because I think that gets rid of the problem, right? If we say, assuming that, we have a unicorn in the audience, right, then it's not, right. The problem is, this is what Michael Munger calls the unicorn theory of government. We can all imagine a state of the world. We know what a unicorn looks like, right? We can all imagine one, okay? But yours probably looks different from mine, okay? And it's never been cited in the real world. So my problem with kind of assuming away the problem is precisely because it assumes away all of the difficulties of how it is that we'd actually get there. What I loved about Jose's presentation earlier was he was giving you a statement about some very concrete reforms that he was able to push forward, and he told you exactly how he went about doing in that and explaining to the public and giving them kind of the economic logic behind those policy proposals. And so that kind of a reform measure that doesn't succumb to the unicorn theory, because he's actually dealing with the difficulties of how you make a transition from one state of affairs to another. So instead of saying, assuming that we were living in a world where everyone had a guaranteed basic income of $50,000 a year, okay, we could get rid of the welfare state. Well, yeah, but that's not a difficult problem. That's not getting our hands dirty, right? There are interesting questions about how and why and, if we could ever get to those kind of situations. And those are things that we should talk about. And we should try to hash out, the details of how that could or could not happen. And they're productive conversations to have, but we should get into the hard questions and not skip over them.
Last question.
Yeah.
You have one more.
Okay. Yes, Michael.
What is your assessment of the argument that is made by George Borjas that the real problem with the conflating problem with our analysis is that immigrants are attracted. You basically have so many, particularly in North America, so many possible entrants that there has been, in fact, a dramatic impact on the wages of those at the lowest end of the labor market. And going further than that, saying that this is explaining the power of Trump to be able to make his argument. I'm not taking a position against immigration. I understand that. I'm just wondering what's your assessment of that, because that has a big. When you talk about workers competing with other workers, they're not just competing with other workers who are in the labor force now, but all of those that might be attracted into the labor force. And I just wonder how you analyze that in your framework.
Yeah, I think that's great. I take Borjas on his own empirical work, and his own empirical work says that even when you have large amounts of immigration into local labor markets and you look at the lowest earners within those markets, the negative impact on local wages is 5%. It's minimal. In terms of the lowest skilled workers and looking at large waves of immigration. Now there's lots of different estimates across that, but that's Borjas's own estimates about a number of these. When you look at, a lot of the empirical evidence on immigrants in terms of coming in to take advantage of welfare state benefits, there's minimal evidence that they're on net taking more out of the system that they're putting in. So I tend to want to look at the empirics about how do actual labor markets respond to large influxes of immigration. And in many cases, there's a lot of ways in which they're complementing or coming in and filling in markets that are not well filled in local labor markets. Now, of course, that's going to vary across time and space. Okay, in different contexts. It's also going to be, a question of magnitude in particular countries. Europe right now is facing, a large influx of workers of a variety of different skill levels. And to the extent that different markets in Europe are going to be able to absorb those workers, both in labor markets and culturally, is a big open question. But on Borjas's own estimates, I don't worry so much about, I'm really not so worried about the impact on native labor wages yet, but I'm open to being convinced if there's good evidence on the other side. Thank you.